Hello and welcome to episode 19 of Airs for Architecture with me, Ambrose Gillick. I'm talking today with Professor Greg Keeffe of the School of Natural and Built Environment at Queen's University in Belfast. We talk about two pieces of his writing, Bin Burger, from the Waste Age exhibition, currently on at the Design Museum in London, and his chapter with Rob Roggema, Born, Not Made, Designing the Productive City, in the 2020 book Designing Sustainable Cities, edited by Rob Roggema and published by Springer.
O'Riordan famously said there's only three types of people who are interested in sustainability. He said the first ones are deep greens. They think we should retreat from the 21st century, live in woods, do everything natural. And they say the earth is the major thing. So it majors on ecology and says society and economics, the other two legs of sustainability need to adapt to a one planet living model. And then the second one is the environmental manager, who says we really like our society. And what we're going to do is we're going to manage our way out of the problem by being careful. So we're going to make regulation about the ecology and regulation about the economy to balance and not do stupid things, right? And then the third one is the cornucopian technologist, who says we can imagine our way out of this future by inventing loads of new things. There's nothing natural left. We've already trashed the planet. We might as well see it as a cyborg, and we go on and do it. And the problem is, he says they're the only three options.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture, and space.
Hello and welcome again. I'm speaking to Greg Keeffe. Greg, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Greg Keeffe. I'm Professor of Architecture and Urbanism at Queen's University Belfast, and this year I'm on sabbatical and I'm in Cornell, where I'm a visiting professor at the School of Architecture.
And what's that visiting professorship based around? Is that just did you have to pitch to them what you were going to do, a research project on a particular thing, or?
They invited me over, particularly to increase their knowledge on climate adaptation and sustainability. So I'm running a studio each semester on those sorts of issues and working with younger staff to help them, learn to teach this sort of stuff. I've been doing it for quite a long time now, as you know, Ambrose. I think it's my 34th year of teaching, which is incredible, really.
That is incredible. And this issue, I suppose my first encounter with your thinking on this was in my second year of undergraduate at Manchester, where you ran was it a module? Did you run the whole second year? But we were looking at...
Yeah, it was a studio, I think, wasn't it? Was it an option studio sort of thing?
Yeah, bioclimatic architecture.
Yeah.
And it seems strange to me that even in an esteemed institution like Cornell, they would still need to drag you all the way across the Atlantic to teach them how to do it.
Yeah, it's been weird, really. I suppose, I got into it, I was always into it, really, from a young age. And I was continually told when I was a student that you couldn't do sustainable architecture, that there was no theory about it, that there was no grounding idea about it, that what you do is you did architecture and you made it sustainable, apparently, at the end. And I was like furious about that, and it was that fury as a young person that made me think, F you, I'm gonna make my own theories and make a difference in this world and make a new sort of architecture and teach people about it. And that's really what that bioclimatic architecture studio was about, was really me inventing a set of theories to give one to the man, sort of thing.
Yeah. your undergirding principle.
Exactly.
Have you maintained the fury?
Yes, I have. Yeah. I've got better at controlling it, but I have an underlying passion, for the planet, really, which I've always had, and for living things. And I don't particularly like humans, so that's also been interesting. And I don't like narrow-minded people, so that's also been quite good fun, because there were a lot of very narrow-minded people in sustainability when I first got there, and that was as problematic as as the other side of the people who told me you couldn't be sustainable.
What do you mean by this narrow-mindedness? I mean, I understand the narrow-mindedness of the anti-sustainable stuff, and really they still dominate. Let's be honest, they're winning.
Yeah.
What does narrow-mindedness in sustainability look like?
Well, I think when I first started, a lot of the people into sustainable architecture were physicists who'd been kicked out of the nuclear program and were thermodynamicists and were designing the most horrendous things, inhumane things that used no energy. And they were as big a problem as the other thing, because I always felt that sustainable architecture would be better than architecture, not worse than architecture. That it would be more life enhancing, more beautiful, more embodying our life spirit or something, and not an insulated box with tiny windows. In a cube, because a cube's got the lowest surface area or something. They were really narrow-minded people, and so and they didn't particularly like me. Generally
speaking,
and they're very passive-aggressive physicists, amazingly, generally.
But this, you I think you slur yourself when you say you don't really like people. That's not how I've ever understood your passion for sustainability, which is a humanistic heart to it. But I thought
I meant people with a big P.
Oh right, like the masses.
Well, not the masses, just how society is organized. I've always been counterculture, I think.
But so I sent you these 3 provocations, and the first one I called it themes, but really it's about the philosophy of sustainability, and I've tried to kind of work my head around it over the years as well, because since doing that unit with you, I've always kind of preferenced the sustainable thing, and sort of as perhaps it was just excellent teaching, perhaps you were just unbelievably dominant and I couldn't resist your arguments, but I don't really think so. But for me, that the issue is one to do with capitalism. Is there a relationship between unsustainability in your reading and the actual political economic condition that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, I always think that if I think of the first experiment about the environment was probably J.B. Priestley's bell jar, where he put a mouse and a candle in a bell jar and they both died. And then he put a mouse, a candle, and some plants in a bell jar and they all lived. And that was done in 1788, I think. Right, and modern capitalism was already 100 years old at that point. So the whole system was set up before we knew the first thing about even the most basic thing about ecology. And so I just think capitalism is fundamentally flawed as an idea. I really do. And that's part of my rage is about having to live in a system that's sort of fundamentally flawed. I find that really annoying, as I'm quite a perfectionist in lots of ways, and I find that continually annoying.
They sort of our economic, the industrial capitalist system is predicated on, I don't know, is it perpetual growth, perpetual newness?
Yeah, I think they say it's about 4% inefficient, don't they, capitalism, and so it has to have a growth of about 4% to maintain its status quo, and one of the problems with it is it doesn't account for everything comes from the earth for free. So if you put that into the model, then it's really super inefficient, because to replace the iron ore in the ground takes 100 million years, but we're getting it for free. We see it as only the labor cost, but actually there's an ecological cost to that removal, which isn't costed into any of the capitalist models, which goes back to the bell jar experiment. There was an idea that the earth was put there for us to exploit, previous to that, which is a sort of Renaissance idea, of the planet, isn't it? That it's there to exploit,
Yeah, I mean, it's someone I mention quite a lot, I think, in these podcasts, but in Hannah Arendt's book, The Human Condition, she cites the three causes of modernity, one being the telescope, one being the Reformation of the Catholic Church, and the third one being the discovery of the New World, and the beginnings of an absolute frenzy of consumption. So I do wonder whether when we talk about the root cause being capitalism, actually the root cause is modernity itself, that the modern paradigm is fundamentally unsustainable.
Yeah, I think that's probably quite reasonable. I suppose, I always think of the cornucopian technologists as being the embodiment of the idea of science can solve problems. So the answer to cars is electric cars, and then the answer to electric cars is drones, and then the answer to drone, and it puts economic growth at the heart of an invention, at the heart of the ideas of how we progress. So we don't progress. You look at GDP, it continues to grow, but actually the indexes of happiness and things continue to shrink. But the problem is inventions don't sort out happiness. But we still focus on invention. It's a problem for architecture because actually architecture doesn't invent very much. And I think I think when we cared about people, architecture was really in the fore in the 20th century, early 20th century. And then when we stopped caring about people so much, architecture has sort of lost its importance to a certain degree, in terms of the big names in society who you think are changing things. I think you'd have probably had, Corbyn there in the 1920s, or Frank Lloyd Wright, whereas now it's Elon Musk and and Jobs and all those sorts of guys. That there's no architects in that list of world thinkers and world changers.
No,
I think that's because we don't invent things.
No, we're not taught to either, are we?
No,
we're not.
I always think back to that David Harvey thing. One of the most depressing things I ever read was David Harvey saying architecture is the laundering of excess capital. That we only build things when we've got a boom on, and what we do is we launder capital into architecture. And so actually, I always thought architecture was about making the world better for people, but really it's just about laundering capital from one place to another and sequestering it somewhere, and that's a very sad and very cynical way of looking at it.
That's a really good way of putting it, because I went into London recently, and they're ruining London at the moment. It's becoming a sort of pound shop New York, isn't it? With these just hideous tower blocks all across the south side. And it actually looks like Pyongyang. It looks sort of like, there's a large swathes of it that look like sort of really impoverished late communist housing, which, people spend 400,000. And I was thinking to myself, even the glossy ones, even the well-designed or the immaculately presented ones, I can't see how they can be economically viable. So there must be something else at hand, at play.
Yeah, Kevin Logan, who works for McCrae Lavington, told me that occupation was a 6-tier activity of housing. That there's money to be made in 5 tiers beyond that, from the purchase of land to the applying for planning permission to the selling of planning permission and options to the design of a scheme to the sell of a scheme to someone else to build it. There's all sorts of tiers of places where money can be earned, and actually occupation is very messy and not very profitable.
Yeah.
So actually, I went to the opening of Terry Farrell's office in Manchester a few years ago, only because it was free beer. And Terry Farrell's son runs the office, and he gave me his business card, and he said, have a look at the other side of the card. And I turned it over, and it was in Chinese script. And he says, because we're actually the development arm of a Chinese bank, and we've come to Manchester to invest a vast amount of Chinese money, and that's how I make my money. I'm not really an architect anymore. I'm the development arm of a Chinese bank. And so this is why you get those buildings. He says we're designing buildings to sell to Chinese investors, not to sell to English investors.
No.
And so he says, and the great thing about it is the Chinese think the best buildings are next to railways and next to stations. So we get really cheap land and we sell it really expensively in China because it's not the land that people want in England. Right. And I was just I was rather drunk, and I just spat my beer out and left the party, thinking I don't want to be part of this, even though the beer was free.
And you went home and made a TikTok video and gave the CCP a little bit more money. Yes. So globalization is obviously... Globalization, I read recently, was someone put that globalization is in fact just Sinofication. Globalization is predicated on the 1.3 billion Chinese souls that there are, and their exploitation, obviously, and control, and the production of very, very cheap goods. I mean, obviously, the best Chinese goods are very great, and so on and so forth. But, people like me don't get to engage with those kinds of levels of products. It's just cheap plastic. But this idea, and it's something that in one of the papers that you sent me, the chapter from the book, and I will draw that up right now. Not the writing for the Design Museum one, which we will get to because it's hilarious. The bin burger, which we need to talk about the bin burger that you wrote with what's his name, Roggema.
Yeah, Rob Roggema. Yeah.
Rob Roggema. That globalization is this good thing because it creates a sharing of ideas. But that seems like a very small good in something that has essentially an inherently pathological character.
I thought, well, it's I suppose one of our jobs as designers is to make things better, isn't it?
Okay.
And because I think if design was about anything else than making things better, it'd be a pretty pointless activity. Surely every design should make things better, at some levels. So I was thinking about that, and then part of that means you have to try and amplify. There's two things: you can make things less bad, or you can make things more good, can't you? And and I've always had the idea that we should try and emphasize on accelerating good things rather than trying to stop bad things. I think trying to stop bad things is a sort of fool's errand for architects.
Yeah. Because
I don't think we're particularly good at stopping bad things, but we are quite good at making good things better, and making things more good. So I suppose it was sort of saying that, and I suppose it was in a Japanese context as well, that paper. So where I think Japan actually hasn't globalized so much, amazingly. Japan is quite a closed society, and actually has real peculiarities, in the way, buildings don't appreciate in value in Japan. They depreciate from the moment they're built.
Oh, do they?
So and actually if you buy a new building, if you build a building, you're expected to knock it down and build a new one. So having a building on the site means that the site is less valuable than one with nothing on it. So they have a car depreciation model to real estate, which is the exact opposite of the rest of the world, for example. But it makes a really interesting urbanism where they end replacing lots of stuff every 15 years, which sounds bad, but it could be good, you see, because if you look at the average city, 90% of the buildings don't meet the current building regs. So in Japan, much higher percentage of the buildings meet the thermal regulations for buildings because they're all new. So if you made demountable material buildings, then maybe that model would be really good because we'd have a faster change of things. And if you didn't like stuff, the chances are it'd be gone shortly.
Yes.
which might help your view of South London.
Yeah, exactly. So obviously Japan is sort of a post-growth culture, isn't it? Its
Yeah.
population has
Yeah.
stagnated and is precipitously falling off, and it's been in a sort of perpetual state of recession or borderline recession. So it's had to kind of reimagine how things work, whereas ours remains locked in this cycle of speculative growth, which is unreal, in fact. And as you say, as you say, the housing model is exactly that, where it's a remarkable beast, the way that, say, for example, suburban sprawl, volume house building, suburban sprawl is conceptualized. It's almost risk-free for everybody bar the consumer.
Yeah, exactly. I think you're right there. And also, one thing, the buildings are always viewed from the air, on the images there, or internally. So the public realm is completely unexplored or undefined, or actually doesn't really exist. So actually the way you actually live in those places has not ever been experimented. So there's no shops, no dentists, no primary schools. They really are just an embodiment of capital, aren't they? And I think that's a really interesting thing, and it's come from this idea of architecture as pornography, that we view it without people in it, with pristine images. It's not that you look at Art Daily or Dezeen, that they're basically peddling pornography, aren't they? Of a sort, of a sort of an essentialist idea of the architecture, and not really anything about its existential quality.
No, or even the building as a moment in time. They're time free, so there's no idea of, as you say, there's no idea of the origins of its production, which includes the origins of the material. So whether they're coming from strip mine land in Chile or Gujarat or wherever it is, or the Congo, and there's no sense of them as occupied spaces afterwards. Like, what does a piece of architecture look 25 years down the line?
Yeah, and you look at, say, some of the modernist things that have been demolished, such as Hume Crescents or Robin Hood Gardens. They were much more generous in terms of public realm. It was flawed public realm, but at least there was some idea that there was a way of having a game of football, or as a kid, or climbing in some trees or something. These things have no public realm.
No,
most of them. They just fill the block with a thing. And so I think there's these are horrible times, and it's really interesting. I was reviewing some applications for Cornell's master's program, because they said they're after a different sort of person on the master's program to come and do their advanced master's program, and they're saying, would you have a look at some of the applications and say, are we choosing the wrong people? And so I was looking at these applications, and there was a personal statement from someone from, say, Karachi, and it says, I'm really interested in historic Karachi and its meaning and place and this. And then you open the portfolio and there's a 50-story tower block, all zigzaggy, with amazing render. And every portfolio is almost identical that comes to Cornell. With these, and I'm trying to assess the portfolio, and I'm thinking, do all I assess is how good are they at rendering? Mm-hmm. Is that the only thing I can really assess from this application? Because the written thing doesn't match the thing they've designed. There's no proposition in what they've created. And that's again to do with that pornography of architecture. That making the great image now is more important than caring about what you're making.
Yeah.
Which links to that thing about strip mining, or where the materials come from, or whatever. And of course, 45% of the impact of a city is materials for building. Well, it was in London in the city limits. 44%, actually, I think, in that study was materials for building. Was the ecological impact.
But we've just recently had COP26 in Glasgow, and amusing for me to stand at the sidelines and scoff. But that is the sustainability of economics, isn't it? That's where we've got to. I suppose my ultimate question is: does the description of sustainability that we currently have in architecture is it actually realizable in architecture, or is it or do we need a new description? Because the description we've got is based around capitalism, and the tools of the master will never disassemble the master's house. We're trying to capitalism our way out of capitalism. Yeah. And that's what COP26 proposes. We're going to do, you've got Jeff Bezos with his cock rocket flying to the edge of space to tell us that space is very thin and the world is very tender. The one I heard yesterday was that he's having the biggest super yacht in the world built in central Holland. And to get it out, they're going to have to take down one of Rotterdam's historic bridges so it can get through. And this guy has got the hubris, the balls to turn up. Yeah. So I just wonder, do we need a new idea of sustainability that is actually meaningful to architecture?
Yeah, well, O'Riordan famously said there's only three types of people who are interested in sustainability. He said the first ones are deep greens. Mm-hmm. They think we should retreat from the 21st century, live in woods, do everything natural. And they say the earth is the major thing. So it majors on ecology and says society and economics, the other two legs of sustainability, need to adapt to a one planet living model. Mm-hmm. And then the second one is the environmental manager, who says we really like our society. Mm-hmm. And what we're going to do is we're going to manage our way out of the problem by being careful. Mm-hmm. So we're going to make regulation about the ecology and regulation about the economy to balance and not do stupid things, right? Mm-hmm. And then the third one is the cornucopian technologists, who says we can imagine our way out of this future by inventing loads of new things. There's nothing natural left. We've already trashed the planet. We might as well see it as a cyborg, and we go on and do it. And the problem is, he says they're the only three options. Mm. And the problem I have is none of them look particularly good to me. No. So I had this idea of sort of techno tree hugging, which is somewhere around the back of the technology one and the tree hugging one. Would there be some place where the technologies would be sort of biomimicry, and the ethics would be one planet living, the planet as a soul, indigenous things matter, and somehow around the back you'd find some sort of space for a new idea of sustainability that enjoyed inventing benign things to improve, that didn't damage the ecology. And I suppose that's where I've always thought there was some sort of territory that we could maybe a new sort of territory we could sit in.
Is that a kind of environmentalist or environmental architecture version of Kenneth Frampton's critical regionalism, where you take what's good about modernity? Sorry, that's not a. You don't look very pleased about that. But that idea that you can take what's good about modernity, because there's many things that are good about it, not least the socio-political sphere of emancipation and equality and egalitarian principles, which have up until fairly recently underpinned what we've been on about, what modernity has been on about.
It's interesting. I took a side. I breathed deeply because actually, when the 7 Lessons for the Millennium came out, which was like the corollary to Kevin Frampton's thing, I actually thought it was really fantastic, and I thought this is really good, but it sort of got hijacked by the hyper conservative, and so now that critical regionalist view is peddled by people who want no change. It's been turned into some sort of crazy no change agenda driven thing where being careful is the answer, and being careful means we have to do exactly what our forefathers did, and we have to love heritage, and everything's heritage, and we care about everything. And I just think we've got to be radical. You know, we're heading for 3-planet living by the middle of the century. We need a radical change, and the problem is, I don't think that provides a blueprint for enough radical change.
No.
So that's the problem I have with it. You know, how I always remember there's a book called Permanence by Carl Schroeder, and in it he says basically either aliens don't exist, or they're already here, and they use technology so advanced we call it nature, we can't see it. You know, and that's my dream, that we make a sort of a natural technology that's so advanced you can't separate it from nature. You know, and that would be my dream, really. I'm getting old. I don't think I'm going to see it.
No, well, probably not. But this idea, this issue around sort of the industrial capitalism, modernity, and all of these things, they all kind of hinge on this idea of individual autonomy. So globalization really is the spontaneous satisfaction of individuated needs. And that I think constitutes a big problem for the sustainability and ecology movement, because that fragmentation, well, firstly, that fragmentation on a social level seems to me to produce, in architecture and urbanism, it produces overabundance. So you have to have, rather than collective living units, you create individuated living units, and therefore the kind of amount of wiring and the amount of pipe work and the amount of heating units and so on and so forth endlessly multiplies. Can you? But there are other nice things to individuality and individuation. Can you do the two things?
I don't know. I was thinking of Adam Curtis's hypernormalization. You know, as a really interesting video to watch. You know, Adam's a bit of a conspiracy theorist generally, but the documentaries are always entertaining. And in that, he calls the 20th century the century of the self. You know, where we aggrandize ourselves. I was amazed when I was working on the project in Nelson, where I was chatting to a guy who told me he was an unemployed packer, and I asked him what does that mean, and he says, I said, I put things in boxes, I pack things. I said, is it a skilled job? He said, no. I said, when did you last do it? He said, 12 years ago, right? And I said, and which political party do you vote for? And he said, the Conservatives. I'm just down on my luck at the moment. You know, I just thought this is absolutely amazing. You know, that we've invented a thing where people who are poor think that they're one lottery card away from being at the other end of the scale. You know, and so instead of organizing and getting together and making a good life, they're waiting for the apparently almost guaranteed option of being wealthy that's going to just appear by chance and put them on the others in the haves rather than the have-nots. And it's a really interesting issue, you know, that I think you're right, because I think we're going to need a lot of organization to get out of the problems we're in. And neoliberalism has removed all the systems that we had in place that could possibly have helped us.
But it seems to me to have also co-opted. I mean, its genius of capitalism is that there's no book, so it can be what it chooses to be, and it is everything to all men. I mean, COP26 was, you know, and all of these kind of climate jamborees. These I mean, they're just a joke. Well, to me, they just seem like a joke. But anyway, they always have their fringe meetings where they have the deep greens and the managerials and all of that, and they seem to have been co-opted by neoliberal system as well. So their sustainability is almost used as a greenwash to cover up the fact that, you know, nothing much has changed.
I think that's you know, I suppose my wife does a lot of research on regulation theory because she's a political scientist, and she says you have to decide whether you're in or out of the policy debate. And the policy networks, you've got to decide whether you engage with governmental bodies, at some level. And as soon as you do that, you get co-opted, and therefore you become part of the establishment by becoming part of those things. And I think that's one of the challenges. I was thinking of Billy Bragg's house being put up for sale last week. I don't know if you saw that. 2.5 million.
Lucky old Billy, hey? Good old socialism.
Yeah, a guy who spent his whole thing singing the red flag has a house worth £2.5 million. And so and of course every system needs dissenters to help you understand why you back the status quo, doesn't it? So even Big Brother had that sort of system, and so maybe that's part of the COP thing that you invite in the dissenters. I think the interesting thing has been the sort of narrative about colonialization has been a new narrative about sustainability, which I think could have amazing traction at some level, because it's a completely different way of seeing pollution as colonialization, seeing, wealth distribution as colonialization, see land use as colonialization. It's giving you a slightly different idea, about a different language to talk about the issues, and I think that might give us some other way of getting into the system, maybe.
Yeah, this idea of environmental justice. There's a very good paper by a guy called David Schlossberg on environmental justice and the kind of tripartite requirements of genuine environmental justice. But he points out the fact that every environmental negative is felt most keenly by those least able to actually address it and escape it. So, flooding in Britain generally looks like people in twee houses on floodplains by the River Severn getting a bit wet, but in Lima and in Caracas or wherever, it looks like the really poor people who live by rivers.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I do this thing called Citizen, where I go off with some guys from TU Delft and University of Siena, and we try and kickstart sustainability in towns. They invite us in, and we do a week-long workshop, and we imagine the future, zero carbon future for them. And we're in Elburg in Holland, and the main guy who was there he was an archaeologist who ran the historic building division of the city. And he told me we have within the city walls 450 heritage listed buildings out of 500, right? And it's a beautiful town and everything. And so I was doing my talk, and I showed a picture of the Maldives, and I said, you're going to have a really good reason for not insulating your 450 heritage buildings. If a panel from the Maldives turned up and asked you, why are you drowning us with your heritage? And he basically threw the table over and walked out of the meeting. And I said, I wasn't criticizing you. I was just saying you just need a really good answer. But you realize that these things are being turned into crazy things where now heritage is sustainability and apparently more important than carbon, and the problem is we need a new definition of what it all means, and what and how we change things, because of course we like heritage, but it's really leaky stuff. But it has embodied energy of building materials already spent. You've got to look at the bigger picture, and somehow this stuff was just really valuable to him because it was his heritage. And he doesn't care that he's got massive gas boilers in there, heating them up because they're all single glazed, But if you get someone from, somewhere where they're really damaged, then you've got to answer. You've got to be able to explain what you're trying to do, haven't you? And I think there isn't enough discourse around that sort of thing.
So there's a kind of quasi-spiritual tenor to this discussion, isn't there? you're talking about a series of, I suppose, higher values. So that the capitalist would say, well, the highest value is, of course, and the modern man, the modern woman, individuated and free, liberated, would say, well, if I want to live in an old leaky house, that's my business. If I can pay the bills, go to hell.
Yeah.
And there needs to be some kind of way of framing this idea of the collective good and a kind of higher responsibility to protecting nature.
Yeah. Because it's interesting. I was thinking of the writings of Walden. This where this sort of idea of self-reliance. Being in America has been really interesting to see the systems in play. And so Walden was about being self-reliant, so you didn't ask your neighbors for stuff. That made you a good human.
Mm-hmm.
You were 100% human. You didn't need other people,
mm-hmm.
and that meant you were closer to God because you didn't need anyone to mediate. It's a Presbyterian idea of a flat society with God
mm-hmm.
floating above. With no free will. So being a good person meant and no forgiveness. So his idea was that you would be unimpeachable with your self-reliance. You know what I mean? And then that turns into the society of the self, the idea of no society, the idea of everything's based on the car. That if you haven't got stuff, it's your own fault. You could have done better. And so actually, I think it comes from a sort of Presbyterian idea in the sort of 18th and 19th century of sort of independence from reliance on other people or something. And of course, we are contingent on all ecological things, are reliant on other things in the system. Lions need worms as much as they need antelope, because without the worms, the grass doesn't grow, the antelopes don't get eaten. So lions need worms. They don't just sit there thinking we're the top dog. They're part of an ecology, and maybe this self thing removes human ecology somehow from the mix. As an idea. And I think we do need each other more than ever, and yet we don't sort of care about that sort of thing. I think we've lost that ethic.
Yeah, we've increasingly, and that fragmentation, that Georg Simmel talks about in the early 20th century. Georg Simmel talks about the metropolitan mindset as being one of kind of isolation, as he talks about it in a sort of semi-psychological way of being a sort of defense mechanism against the visual and cultural and actual noise of the urban realm. So we do become, particularly isolated. But that isolation, I could talk about that for hours, this idea that modernity is predicated on individuation. Boris Pasternak, the author of Dr. Zhivago, said it was the genius of Christianity, that Christianity, and I think he means waspish Christianity, I think, this idea that you become, Christianity individuates people, it breaks down nepotistic and tribal barriers because you have a responsibility for your own soul first and foremost. And I think this is a fascinating idea, and it comes with a lot of upsides, but it does come with this moral obligation to, therefore you have to make this effort to do community and collectivity. And I think that's it's not, whereas in a kind of tribal situation perhaps, or a clannish situation, your individuality is subsumed by the responsibility to the collective without your agreement. You just have to.
Yeah, and that links quite nicely back to Japan. I was really, continually impressed by Japanese culture. One of my students left his iPad and camera on a park bench in Tokyo for 5 hours. And when he came back, it was still there. That wouldn't happen in any other city in the world, would it? Maybe in Saudi Arabia, maybe for other reasons. But that there's this thing, and the idea that Japanese kids, the first thing they do in the morning at school is clean the toilets.
Yeah.
You know, because they have a communal responsibility to keep those toilets clean, and it changes people's idea about how you use a toilet when you clean it yourself. You know, and so Japan has those sorts of things built into it, but it also has individualism, but also this collective responsibility for stuff that you know we could sort of perhaps benefit from. You know.
Yeah. I want to go on to that back to the Rob and your paper again. This idea of that you write about in there is the sustainable urban development. So, if as architects we tend to think about buildings, and we do get trained to think, I think, largely about the artifact of the building and its four sides and its roof, or one side if you're a biomorphic architect, So you suggest this idea of city growth, and you use an organicist analogy. Do you want to talk about that? The idea of evolution.
Yeah, I think, well, Rob's a really interesting person because he's a landscape architect and a really big personality, and he's a really exciting person to work with. I think I lost interest in buildings per se because I was doing a project working on a science park in Cambridge where I was making an adaptive facade for this building. And when the building opened, we were invited to the opening ceremony. And it was a Friday. And I went to the building, and I spent all this time trying to save energy through these movable photovoltaic panels that track the sun and things. And I really enjoyed doing that sort of thing. And then I got to the building, and it was Steak Friday. And everyone in the building was having a free subsidized steak, as they did every Friday. And as a vegetarian, I just looked at the ecological footprint of the steaks sat there in this cafe after I'd saved, 7 kilojoules with this movable facade. And I just thought, I need to get out of this business and do something else. And that got me into urbanism. And then I had to sort of try and invent some theories about urbanism, just like I had done with architecture, really, about how the biotic and the biomimicry that I developed for buildings might come into play in a city or something. And Rob was a really good person for that because he knows a lot about ecological systems. So he was a good person to pick the brains of. And so the project, in a way, is trying to think about how you develop a city rather than having a fixed form that you're heading towards. Trying to make a process-based metabolic analogy of the city that you can take advantage of things in the future to head towards your goal. And I suppose it links to that Kevin Kelly idea of, I don't know if you've ever read his 9 Laws of God. Out of control, but he says it's these 9 laws of natural systems, basically, and one of them is pursue no single goal and pursue no optima. Just keep testing where there's weakness in the system and occupying it, and that was really the idea of that project, really, to try and work out how to work with Japan's completely liberal, no urban design landscape to actually sort of somehow get urban design to happen in an unregulated space.
That sounds kind of complicated.
Yeah, it was.
But how do you take a city like Manchester or Belfast, which are, as you say, they're hundreds of years old and they've been industrial since the very, very, very beginning of industrialism. Manchester particularly so.
Yeah.
How do you reverse engineer a city into a kind of biomorphic, biophilic?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I think there's one of the things you have to do first is change people's mindset. I'd done talks for years about this sort of stuff, and people had laughed at it, thrown things at me, told me I was an idiot. I did a project about, I did a paper at a conference, Sustainable Building 10. right, in Helsinki. And I did this paper showing that Manchester in 2080 will be as hot as Casablanca in summer using Met Office data, and that we had to invent buildings that were going to be cooled in the future. And the chair of the panel told me I was an effing idiot, and how dare this paper be in the conference, right? That guy is now writing about climate change and saying how it's an imperative thing, and so, but what happened in 2011, I did a talk in Leeds Town Hall, and the whole of the audience stood up and gave me a standing ovation. I nearly fell over.
Must have been nice.
Well, I just thought I need to get more radical, actually. but it made me. But actually, there was a change with the last recession that people realised that we did need. So the first thing you need to do is change people's hearts and minds, because then they can do it. And then I think you also have to have a pathway, and you have to have an end vision, and then you've got to edge towards a vision, taking whatever advantages you can, and then you've got to revalue your vision every few years to check you're going in the right place. I think at the moment we don't see cities as sort of having a life. We just see them as now. And I think if you said, what's Manchester like 2050? I did it when in Nelson. I said, what's Nelson like in 2050? And the head of the council said, everyone's on the dole. There's no work here. There's loads of TB. There's loads of infectious diseases. We can't make ends meet, and probably the city will be half empty. That's what he said. And I said, wouldn't it be great if we could have actually a positive vision for where we want to get to? Because I said we can easily get to your vision. I said, if we do nothing, we'll get to your vision. What we need is a different sort of vision. I said, imagine a vision where it was all energy for free because it was all sustainable, where there was communities built up with space for kids to play, where it was really safe, where people knew each other, where everyone got around without the car, where food was grown locally, where you could, I said, you can have that if you want, just as much as you can have the other, but you've got to choose it. And so I realized that's what the citizen thing's about. The first thing we do is we create a shared vision, and then we work out how to get there. And it's been tough, because when we did the one for Amsterdam, the Green Party asked us to do one for Amsterdam.
Yeah.
They got elected, saying they were going to be carbon neutral by 2035. So we did a vision for how to get there, and they embargoed it because it's impossible. Because it involved 900 deep renovations a day of property, right? It involved 8 kilometer squares of photovoltaics a year being installed, involved 24 megawatt wind turbines being installed every year, but it was a great scheme, and it could be done. But they thought it was a matter of just writing on a piece of paper. But if you'd published it and the city saw it, then you'd have to have a discussion about it and saying this is going to be really tough, or we might not make it. But the embargoing of it because they thought they'd be de-elected because it was too crazy, when you're already at 0 feet above sea level. Yeah. I just think that these things are all possible because 8 square kilometers of photovoltaics a year can be done if you really want it to be. Can't it?
I did read yesterday. I was reading a net zero document. I gave a lecture on sustainable energy generation for my undergraduates. It was pretty intense. But the suggestion was that to get to net zero, we need to build the equivalent of the largest photovoltaic plant, which is somewhere in India, and it's about half the size of Wales. No, it's not quite. No, it's pretty darn huge. Yeah. But we need to build one of them every day. But that is obviously based around not building any other forms of things, and it doesn't take into account the possibility of integration into architecture.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, the first thing you want to do is reduce, you know, and the problem is that we never start with reduce because it doesn't appeal to those cornucopian guys. They like the idea of giant wind turbines and photovoltaic things, but actually the first thing to do is to reduce our demand, isn't it? And actually we don't often start with that.
No, and that's, for me, that's always the thing. That's sort of the elephant in the room, is that no one's talking about not upgrading their phone.
No.
My guess is that even with all of these kind of conventions and declarations on energy reduction, I was looking at the figures yesterday. How did it go? It was absolutely amazing. The amount, all of our energy reduction declarations, we've still, everybody's probably using more energy than they've ever used. Because their phones now are bigger and batteries, and all of the exercise that people do these days. Bloody hell. I mean, they're now eating more calories so that they can exercise. I mean, exercise is possibly the least sustainable thing anybody's ever done, but especially in gymnasiums.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a figure that I saw from the beginning of this year. China's coal mining hit a record high in December, reaching 384.67 million tons, a 7.2% increase on the year before.
I know.
And, what do you do then?
Yeah, I know. The thing is, I think eco-anxiety for students is a real issue. I've had quite a few students in my studio who've become so anxious by looking at these figures that it's meant they haven't been able to function, and they've had to, take therapy, to sort themselves out, because these things are pretty tough. But the thing about, I think two things. One is, I have faith in natural systems, somewhere.
Well, you better had to, because they ain't stopping.
I know. Well, I was looking at, I was working out how many pine trees, how many Jurassic pine trees is a gallon of petrol.
Mm-hmm.
It's 50. Right. So every gallon of petrol is 50 Jurassic pine trees.
Gosh.
It's 100 tons of lumber.
Wow.
Right, and each pine tree, modern pine trees, are about 2 tons when we harvest them. So we've burnt 60 million years of carbon, so Jurassic carbon so far in the last 50 years. So these are tough times, aren't they?
Yeah, but then we come back to this. So that it's an unvirtuous circle. I don't know, a vicious circle, isn't it? It's so you're talking about going to the Chinese conglomerate buying up central Manchester, and to be quite honest, when I go to Manchester now, it's quite nice. When I went as a student, it looked like someone had just set it on fire and then put it out by peeing on it. No, it was great. It was amazing, but it was certainly not as Tony and swanky as it is now.
No.
And so that Chinese increase in energy use, coal use, correlates directly to their economic growth, which is the reason why cities like Manchester can pull themselves out of the ashes. So again, we have this difficulty, don't we?
Yeah, we do, and I always said, so I was asked on a newspaper thing, what should we do to become sustainable? Number one thing to do, and I said, educate people about greed, give them therapy. Because that's the number one thing, isn't it? Actually, the Jeff Bezos thing just sums it up, really, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
The fact is, he doesn't need any more money. Why is he still running that company? Why do we need all this stuff? Why do we need more and more things around us? Why do we dream of a better car, a better thing? And it's greed, isn't it? And it's some problem with our psyche about, about the lack of living with your own mortality, as Heidegger said. Being is knowledge of your own death, living with knowledge of your own death, which other creatures don't have. I don't know whether that's true or not, because I've never been another creature.
No, I've got a cat, and I think it knows.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think my dog might know. But I think, but it's an interesting idea, isn't it? That somehow because we know we're sort of collecting for that rainy day that's coming.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow that greed is the biggest problem, because with you can put, what did Oxfam say? You can put 80% of the world's wealth on a double-decker bus.
Yeah,
it's 50 people. Yeah. It's 50 people, 80% of the world's wealth, and of course there's the carbon thing. I was thinking 20% of all carbon outputs into the atmosphere are from war games.
Mm-hmm.
It's absolutely insane. They have war games, not actually war.
Yeah.
20% of the carbon is from just flying planes around pretending to have a war.
Well, I saw something very good yesterday. This young lad at a university in America has hacked into the flight systems, the flight tracking systems of the world's elite, Mark Zuckerberg's and Jeff Bezos's, which they keep kind of hidden, and he's hacked into them, and he puts them on Twitter, and he's calculated that these global elite billionaires, the kind of people that turned up to COP26, produce as much carbon through their private jet flying as the whole of Denmark.
Which isn't a particularly sustainable country. It's in the top 5 countries, for ecological footprinting. Denmark.
Is it?
Yeah. So that is amazing, though, isn't it? You see, and so, but there's been an argument about elites since society began. The city is a contested space. Whether it's in Piedmont, Malatesta throwing a bomb in the prince's cart and starting the Italian Revolution. We've continually railed against the elite, haven't we? And then what's happened is another elite's turned up when you've got rid of the last elite. And I suppose the perpetual revolution is quite interesting, because maybe it takes time to become an elite, and maybe these sorts of things. I always think it's interesting that the royal family are always pictured with an uncocked shotgun. And I always think it sort of says, if you really decide to have a revolution in Britain, we'll shoot you. I think that's a subliminal image, isn't it, of that sort of thing, of Prince Philip with an uncocked shotgun. Because I've never had a photo of me taken with a shotgun. Maybe because I don't own one. But you know what I mean? This is sort of an interesting idea, isn't there, about what you position the royal family with, and quite often it's with uncocked shotguns.
The other one that I find interesting is the way that elite people are often photographed dressed either in racist clothing or Nazi clothing. I'm fascinated by this. I know a lot of right-wing people, and none of them would dream of going to a party dressed like that. Wouldn't cross their mind. Not because they're racist, but because it's really rude. And yet you get it like Prince Harry, the guy Max Mosley, Justin Trudeau. It's like, what's wrong with these people? Maybe that's part of the same messaging. Is like, if you touch us, look how nasty we can be.
Well, what did one of the Tories say the other day about Boris Johnson? You'll need a Panzer division to get him out of Downing Street.
Oh my God.
And I thought, what weird language to use in a democracy. That you'll need a Panzer division, to get him out. It's really interesting how the sort of language used, and I suppose the thing is, I keep thinking sustainability is not frightening. It's like it could be I did a project looking at waste streams in Northern Ireland, and by repurposing the waste streams of plastic and timber and so forth, and sort of vegetable waste, you could make a plant that produced insulated panels out of plastic that was going to landfill, with timber to support them and things. And I realized you could do 35. You had enough materials for 30,000 homes a year, deep renovation, with waste streams, which would create 1,000 permanent jobs, and turn Northern Ireland into a zero carbon thing in 30 years. So there's amazing things there to do, aren't there? Which could really change people's lives economically, and also change the amount of waste. And yet we still think it's someone else's job to imagine these things.
But this idea, that idea, this which is one of the principles that you outline in your chapter, this idea of spandrels, this evolutionary idea of spandrels. It's not just physical gaps, but it's the kind of intellectual and cultural gaps that we have. Capitalism produces abundant waste, which should and could be put to use for a better urban environment. But I just wanted to ask last thing about architecture is a very small business now. We deal with a very elite group of people who can afford our services. We don't, either clients or individuals, social housing providers, councils, governments, and rich people. But what can it do? What can it do? What can little architecture do?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I think one thing I put in some money to the EU to do this, which was to create a wiki of city solutions designed by anybody. And I wanted to create a massive database where anyone in any city could design a bit of their city. Because I think the thing we're short of at the moment in architecture are visions for the future and transformative schemes. And I think we're the only people who can draw those up and rally people. It's been really interesting with the Citizen project, because the first question we get asked when at the end of the week, we present this amazing scheme of how you're going to decarbonize this neighborhood to the city. And it's all about making a walking city, a cycling city, sharing community energy, community food production, all these different things. And the first question that gets asked, usually by the mayor, is, how much does this cost to do? Right? And the interesting thing is, we never really had an answer for that, right? Until we're in a place called Roslera in Belgium, where this crazy old guy who was about 70 stood up and said, "You're an idiot." He says, "Have you seen this beautiful future for Roslera?" He says, "How much does it cost not to do?" And since then, I ask the question now, how much does it cost not to do? And to ask that question, you have to have a vision that's beautiful and better. And that's what we've got to do with architecture. We've got to go back to it being somehow utopian, based on some existing positions where we can deliver it, but it's utopian, because then you can say, how much does it cost not to do, instead of how much does it cost to do. And I think that's the positive thing. And actually, Roslera have done a lot of the things.
Oh, have they?
Yeah, I had an email at Christmas from the key guy going through the massive list of things they've done since we went. It's absolutely incredible. Community energy systems, community food systems, new cycle routes. They've really got on with it amazingly.
That's
unbelievable.
Wonderful. Yeah. So how do we teach this? How does this reach down? Because obviously, we've got to get the young architects thinking about this. How do you do it when you've got a 12-week module and you've got to hit your REBA, ARB, assessment criteria, etc., etc.?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I think what you do is, I think you can do it. I think you work in groups on the urban design strategy, and then you take some part of it and you turn it into architecture. I think because this stuff all makes program. There might be a new market in the neighborhood that sells locally produced food, and then you design that as part of the thing. But I think we've got to start thinking bigger than just a building on a corner. I just think I did a review at a school of architecture. I'm not going to say which one, where they were doing uh, uh, a kindergarten on a street corner, right? And I said I went back to work and said this was what a boring project it was. And one of the old members of staff, who was older than me, said, "Greg, you think it's boring now? I did that project when I was in second year too, when I was there." And I said, "How long ago was that?" And he said, "That was 1984." And they were doing the same project for second year, first semester on the same site. And they've been doing it for nearly 40 years.
Wow.
You know, and I just thought, you know, and what there are too many schools of architecture in the UK, aren't there? I think 7 or 8 would be a good number, with really large numbers of staff, with amazing options for students, you know, with incredible student bodies who in their thousands can raid the RIBA and demand change. You know, we're very distributed at the moment, aren't we? Which I think is a bit of a shame. And you know, I'm very jealous of TU Delft. You know, with its 600 kids in year 1. 250 academics. And really the one-stop place in Holland for making change. The government come to them for advice because they're the only game in town. And they have a lot more agency than any of the schools in the UK. And Holland's got 20 million people, so we'd have about 3 or 4 TU Delfts. If we were that size, maybe there'd be a Scottish school, a Northern school, a Midland school, a Southern school. Maybe that'd be it.
Yeah. And the Architectural Association.
Doing its own thing with rich people. For rich people. Rich people have got to go somewhere.
That's what I always argue. Rich people have to have kindergarten too.
But I think those sort of things. Yeah. So I think we need to be more visionary, and
But I like this idea that there's this one quote that we want to see a biodiversity of solutions to these problems, ones that are unique to their place. This idea of a plural identity for sustainability, which we don't get because of the kind of neoliberal idea of sustainability. This idea that is based around a very narrow idea of value within architecture. But if we locate ourselves in place and we are more spontaneous, I love this idea that you said earlier of not this quote of not having kind of an objective. This idea of not being fixated on a goal, but on the process of getting there. This leads to a plural.
Yeah, and I think it's so true. I keep looking at Kingspan, and how much Kingspan is in the world. That's the next asbestos, isn't it? That material, and every project is the only way you can meet the apparent goals is by specifying something that's highly toxic for the environment, for you, and yet, every scheme has a piece of Kingspan in it, and we know it's going to be the most horrendous material known to mankind, don't we? Yet we specify it, and I just think, a biodiverse set of solutions would offer a lot of different options for that one, just that one thing. Never mind all the other things.
Well, it's the weirdness of this. Yeah, so Kingspan or Celotex everywhere, and yet when you look at nature and nature's solutions to issues of insulation, I mean, the peculiarity of our Earth compared with all the other planets we've managed to look at is just the sheer abundance of the damn thing. Like, it cannot stop inventing.
Yeah.
And yet
it's so beautiful.
Oh, it's lovely, isn't it?
Yeah. And we're always heading to one solution.
One solution.
So I remember being shocked at working with a housing architect where they said we have to use these robust details, which are standard details for apparently building a house, and they're all full of Celotex, as you say. Just thinking, they're robust in I was trying to work out what sense of robust are they robust, because they're not robust ecologically.
No.
You know, they're really dangerous ecologically. They're super fragile ecologically. They're damaging ecologically, but they're robust from hitting it with a truck, are they? Or maybe from driving rain. I don't know. You know, it was a weird idea because it was a really small idea of robustness. You know,
I think it's robust in the sense. I actually think this is what they mean. It's a misuse of the word. It's robust in the sense that it can't be screwed up by a builder.
All right. I was thinking
it's so simple that nobody could bugger it up.
Right. I was wondering if it was robust legally, so you couldn't be sued for it.
Yeah, there'll be that as well. So you won't get, if you put it like this, you won't get cold bridging, and you won't get water ingress. That's all it. I mean, they don't mean that it's actually robust. It's like they've taken the word robust, and they've made it mean shit, and then. It's like they've taken the word sustainability and made it mean shit as well. It's like
yeah. It's you know, I started my studio this semester with a quote from the School of Rock.
It's a great film.
The School of Rock, you know, and it says, "Do you know the man?" It's going, it's going. The man, he ruined the ozone. He chopped down the Amazon, and he put Sappho in a chlorine tank. And we used to have a way to giving it to the man, and it's called rock. You know, and they ruined that with MTV. You know, and the man's ruined architecture. You know, we had a way of giving it to the man. It was called architecture.
Yeah.
You know, and it was great. You know, you look at Nelson, where we did the project. The houses there were really small, built of stone. And they were all made by volunteers in a building society. A Presbyterian church built most of the houses with their own congregation.
Yeah.
You know, they opened their own quarry. They harvested it at the weekend when they were working in a factory 12 hours a day for the rest of the week. And they built an amazing settlement. You know, and so, you know, so architecture used to be the way we gave it to the man, you know. We've got to go back to that. That's got to be the final thing. It's time that architecture gave it to the man. Yeah.
Fantastic. I think we'll finish on that. Thank you ever so much, Greg. That was fantastic.
That was good fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is great. But it's true, isn't it? Architecture used to be the way we gave it to the man, you know, and I think we've got to find a way of doing that again. Yeah.
I do believe so. Thank you ever so much. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, it was good fun.
Well, that was wonderful. Thanks to Greg Keeffe for his time, his ideas, and his wild imagination. Please look in the podcast description for links to his professional profile and online presence. And don't forget to like, subscribe, follow and share A is for Architecture everywhere. Cheers.